Why did a young, racist cop punch an old black man, only to discover he was an off-duty FBI agent? As the incident unfolds, the officer faces a moral and legal reckoning that forces him to confront his biases and the broken system he's part of. What happens next changes everything. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today, and if you enjoy this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe. So, let's get started. John Parker had always dreamed of becoming a police officer. Growing up in Pineville, a small town nestled in the southern heartlands, he admired the men and women in blue. To him, they were symbols of strength and authority. People who made sure the rules were followed and protected the community from the bad elements. But the version of the world he grew up with was a narrow one, colored by the biases of those around him. Pineville was divided, physically and socially. The town was a mix of well-maintained suburban streets, predominantly white, and older, neglected neighborhoods with a majority black population. The people Parker considered his mentors, older officers in the Pineville Police Department, were clear about their thoughts. The black neighborhoods were trouble spots, places where crime thrived and where officers needed to be vigilant. Parker soaked up these attitudes, internalizing their distrust and hostility. He had been on the force for 3 years now, and his sense of duty was fueled by a need to prove himself, both to his colleagues and to himself. He wanted to show he was tough, that he had what it took to maintain order. But underneath his confidence, there was a fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, and most of all, fear of not fitting in with the seasoned officers he idolized. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Parker was assigned to the night shift, patrolling Sector 7, an area that his colleagues often referred to with a smirk and a shake of the head. It was the predominantly black part of town, and for Parker, it meant an opportunity to prove he was capable of handling himself. He didn't say it aloud, but he believed trouble was waiting, just out of sight, and he was ready for it. It was around 11 p.m. when Parker's cruiser rolled down Maple Street, a stretch lined with run-down buildings, corner stores, and vacant lots. His eyes darted left and right, scanning for anything that seemed out of place. A flicker of movement caught his attention. A man, perhaps in his 60s, was standing beside a black sedan parked under a streetlight. The man's skin was dark, his hair grayed, and he was looking down at a phone in his hand. Parker's training should have told him this was an innocuous scene. A man standing by his car, checking his phone, there was nothing criminal about that. But years of bias, both conscious and unconscious, filtered what he saw. To Parker, the man was suspicious. Maybe he was casing a place or waiting for someone to pick up drugs. The rationale didn't matter. Parker had already made up his mind. He pulled the cruiser over and got out, hand resting on his holstered weapon as he approached. "Hey, you there," he barked. "What are you doing out here?" The man looked up, and his expression remained calm, unfazed by Parker's aggressive tone. "Evening, officer," he replied politely. "I'm just checking my GPS." Parker's eyes narrowed. "This is a high-crime area. What are you really doing?" The man raised an eyebrow but remained composed. "I'm waiting for someone, that's all. No need for alarm." But Parker wasn't listening. He was too caught up in his own assumptions, his pulse quickening with a mix of adrenaline and anger. He stepped closer, invading the man's personal space. "Show me your ID," he demanded. The man sighed and reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "All right, officer. Here's my ID." Parker snatched it from him, glancing down at the name, Thomas Wright. But instead of looking at the details or the license photo, Parker's eyes flicked back to the man, suspicion still clouding his mind. "What's in the car?" he asked, gesturing with his chin. "You got anything illegal in there?" Thomas let out a slow breath. "Officer, I'm just standing here. There's nothing illegal about it." But Parker's patience was wearing thin. His fingers twitched, itching to act. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice low and threatening. "Hands on the car." Thomas did as instructed, placing his hands on the hood of the car. Parker's mind raced. He felt the need to assert control, to show that he wasn't someone to be taken lightly. He patted Thomas down roughly, his hands moving with a force that wasn't necessary. When he found nothing, it only made him angrier. "Stop resisting," Parker snapped, even though Thomas was standing perfectly still. "I'm not resisting," Thomas replied calmly. "Just doing what you asked." But Parker wasn't hearing him. The frustration boiled over, and without thinking, he drew his fist back and punched Thomas hard in the side of the face. The older man stumbled, catching himself against the car, a look of shock passing over his features. For a moment, everything was silent. Parker's heart hammered in his chest as the reality of what he'd just done began to sink in. He stared at Thomas, who was now slowly reaching into his jacket. Parker's hand hovered over his weapon, expecting retaliation. Instead, Thomas pulled out a badge, a shiny, gold emblem with 3 letters that made Parker's blood run cold: FBI. "You've made a mistake," Thomas said, his voice level despite the blood trickling from his lip. "I'm Special Agent Thomas Wright, and you just assaulted a federal officer." Parker's eyes widened, his body going rigid. The weight of his actions crashed down on him as he stared at the badge in disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had just assaulted a man with authority far greater than his own, and now he realized the gravity of his mistake. In a moment of panic, Parker tried to stammer out an apology. I didn't know. I thought." Thomas cut him off. "It doesn't matter what you thought. What you did was unprovoked and illegal." He pulled out his phone, pointing the camera at Parker. "I'm documenting this." Parker felt a chill as the red recording light blinked. His career, his future, all of it flashed before his eyes. He had crossed a line, and he knew there was no going back. The next day, Parker's anxiety had transformed into a gnawing fear that followed him everywhere. He sat in the station's locker room, staring at his phone, waiting for some sort of call from his superiors. He knew the department's procedure. Incidents like these would be reviewed, especially with the involvement of an FBI agent. But Parker still held a sliver of hope that things might blow over, that perhaps Thomas would decide not to press charges or that his colleagues would close ranks and protect him. That hope was shattered when his captain, a gruff and seasoned officer named Williams, called him into the office. The look on Williams's face was grave, and his tone offered no comfort. "Sit down, Parker." The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Parker lowered himself into the chair, feeling the sweat bead on his forehead. "What's going on, sir?" Williams leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "We've got a situation. You know the man you put your hands on last night?" Parker's throat felt tight. "Yes, sir. He said he was FBI." "He is," Williams confirmed. "Special Agent Thomas Wright, and he's pressing charges for assault." He paused, his eyes boring into Parker's. "This isn't a small thing. The FBI has launched an internal investigation, and they've got everything." His statement, the video footage. Parker's stomach dropped. "But he didn't tell me who he was until after." "It doesn't matter," Williams interrupted sharply. "You escalated that situation. You acted without cause, and now we're all paying the price." His voice softened slightly, but the disappointment was clear. "Parker, the department's hands are tied. The feds are involved now. They want to make an example out of this." Parker felt like he was sinking, his grip tightening on the armrests of the chair. "What's going to happen to me?" Williams sighed. "You're on administrative leave effective immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon. And Parker, you need to lawyer up." As Parker walked out of the captain's office, a wave of cold realization washed over him. His fellow officers avoided his gaze, whispering among themselves. The sense of camaraderie he once felt now felt like a distant memory. He was alone, and the weight of his choices bore down on him. At home, he sat at the kitchen table, his badge and gun in front of him. The reality of the situation felt surreal. Just days ago, he had felt untouchable, part of a powerful force that could shape the world around him. Now, he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and there was no one to pull him back. A week later, Parker found himself standing outside a small coffee shop, clutching a note he had received from Thomas's lawyer. Thomas had agreed to meet him, and Parker knew this was his only chance to try and make things right. His palms were sweaty as he pushed open the door and spotted Thomas sitting at a table by the window. Thomas looked up, his expression unreadable, as Parker approached. The FBI agent's lip was still bruised from their encounter, a stark reminder of what had happened. Parker pulled out a chair and sat down, his hands clasped tightly together. "Thank you for meeting me," Parker started, his voice hesitant. I just wanted to apologize." Thomas studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Go on." Parker took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his own words. "I was wrong. I should have never acted like that. I let my own prejudices get the better of me, and I'm sorry." Thomas's gaze remained steady. "Do you even know what you're apologizing for, or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" Parker flinched. I know I overreacted. I assumed the worst about you because of where you were and because of your skin color." The admission felt like a weight being lifted, but it was replaced by the shame of saying it out loud. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I've been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment my entire life, Parker. Even with a badge and decades of service, I'm still just a black man to some people." He paused, his voice growing colder. "The fact that you saw me and assumed I was a criminal says everything about what's wrong with your department, and with you." Parker lowered his eyes. "I know. I get that now. But I want to make it right." Thomas's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. "This isn't about you making it right for me. It's about you understanding the system you're a part of. The one that enables and justifies this kind of behavior." He looked at Parker, his gaze piercing. "If you want to make a difference, you start by confronting that system, not just offering empty apologies." Parker nodded, feeling the sting of truth in Thomas's words. "What can I do?" Thomas leaned forward. "For starters, you take accountability. You face the consequences, and you learn from them. But more than that, you need to start speaking up when you see things wrong in your department. It's not enough to just say you're sorry. You have to change the culture you've been a part of." The weight of the task felt immense, but Parker knew it was the only way forward. "I will. I promise." Thomas nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "We'll see." Parker's trial was brief but impactful. With the evidence stacked against him, including the video footage and testimony from Thomas, he was found guilty of assault. He lost his job with the Pineville Police Department and was sentenced to community service, along with mandatory sensitivity and racial bias training. His reputation was in shambles, and many of his former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with him. The punishment, though severe, was not the end for Parker. It was a beginning. As he served his community service hours, he was confronted with stories and experiences from people he had never taken the time to understand. He met black families who had faced harassment similar to what Thomas endured, and he listened, finally realizing that his actions were part of a much larger, more damaging cycle. Thomas, meanwhile, continued his work as an FBI agent, using his position to advocate for better training and accountability in police departments. Though he didn't forgive Parker outright, he watched from afar, observing whether the young cop would make good on his promise. Months later, Parker found himself standing in front of a group of new police recruits, sharing his story, not as a warning, but as a lesson. "I was blind," he told them. "I let my fears and prejudices guide me, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. It's up to all of us to be better, to break the cycle, and to hold each other accountable." Thomas watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, as Parker finished his talk. He didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Perhaps hope, or at the very least, cautious optimism that change was possible. As Parker walked out of the building that day, he knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. The real work had just begun.